Close your eyes for a moment. Dim the lights in your room. Adjust your pillow and let your mind drift away from the world you know. Imagine the glow of a single candle flickering in the darkness, its shadows dancing against rough stone walls. Outside, the night is colder, darker, quieter than anything you've ever known. There is no hum of electricity, no street lamps, no distant cars. Only the soft whisper of the wind and the faint tolling of a bell somewhere in the distance. Now picture yourself not as a noble, not as a knight, not even as a wealthy merchant, but as a servant. A small figure in a vast household, unseen yet indispensable. The masters you serve dine at long wooden tables, laughing, drinking, feasting on roasted meats. You, however, remain in the shadows carrying their trays, cleaning their boots, fetching their water. Every hour of your life is claimed by another. This is not a life of choice. It is a life of survival. You wake before dawn, when the air is still damp and the fire is long gone cold. Your first thought is not of breakfast or comfort, but of duty. The kindling must be set, the floors scrubbed, the chamber pots emptied before your masters stir. You are a ghost in your own time, noticed only when you fail. In this journey, we will step into that world hour by hour, task by task, until the weight of servitude presses down on you, as it did on millions of forgotten souls. You will smell the smoke of the kitchens, feel the sting of icy water on your hands, hear the sharp voice of the housekeeper calling your name. And by the end, you may wonder, could you even survive one single day? So lie back, breathe slowly, and prepare yourself. Tonight, I will take you into the unseen life of a medieval servant. It will be harsh, it will be humbling, and it will remind you just how precious the world you live in today truly is. Before you can understand the life of a servant, you must first understand the world you serve. A medieval household was more than just a home. It was a machine, a living, breathing hierarchy where every deer had its place, and every mistake could bring down the delicate balance of order. At the very top sat the lord or lady of the manor. Their word was law. They held the keys to wealth, to survival, to your very life. Beneath them stretched a ladder of authority, each rung pressing down on the ones below. The steward, stern and calculating, oversaw the finances. The housekeeper, sharp-eyed and unyielding, ruled over the domestic staff. The cook, gruff and fiery, commanded the kitchen like a battlefield. And then, at the very bottom, were you, the servant, a shadow that moved when ordered, a pair of hands to scrub, to carry, to polish. Your name might be remembered, but only when shouted in anger. Your body belonged to the household. Your time was never your own. The household itself was vast and noisy. Kitchens roared with fire and clattered with pans. Courtyards echoed with the stamping of horses. Chambers whispered with the footsteps of maids cleaning floors before the masters awoke. It was a place where wealth was displayed not only through gold and silk, but through the invisible labor of those who toiled in silence. For every noble garment laid out upon a bed, a servant's hands had stitched, washed, and pressed it. For every platter of roasted meat brought to the table, a servant had spent hours in the smoke and heat. For every polished floor and shining goblet, a servant's back had bent, their fingers rubbed raw. The truth is simple. The grandeur of the medieval world rested on the shoulders of its servants. Without them, the castles would crumble into filth, the feasts would never reach the table, and the nobles would be lost in their own chaos. Yet for all this, the servant was never celebrated, only expected. And so, as you step further into this life, remember this. The medieval household was a world where everyone knew their place. The masters commanded, the stewards enforced, the housekeepers controlled, and the servants obeyed. Always obeyed. Step into the grand hall of a medieval manor. At the far end, beneath banners of silk and painted shields, the lord and lady dine at a long oak table. The air is heavy with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and burning candles. Every detail, from the gleam of silver goblets to the polished floor, proclaims wealth, power, and privilege. But look closer, just beyond the glow of the candles. There, in the shadows, stand the servants. You are among them. You hold a tray heavy with food, your arms trembling, yet you must not let it shake. You wait for the moment the Lord nods, and then step forward with perfect obedience. You are not meant to be seen, only to serve. The divide between servant and master was more than clothing, more than wealth. It was a world apart. The master's life was one of choice, when to rise, when to eat, when to travel. The servant's life was one of command. You did not wake when your body begged for rest, but when your duty demanded it. You did not eat when you were hungry, but only after your work was done, if food remained. Masters were measured by honor and lineage. Servants were measured by usefulness and silence. A careless word, a broken dish, or a delayed task could mean punishment, dismissal, or worse disgrace that followed you forever. And yet, for all the wealth that glittered above, the masters depended entirely on the hands below. They could not cook their feasts, clean their chambers, or tend their estates without you. Their luxury was built from your exhaustion. Their elegance rose from your sweat. Still, there was no equality here, no recognition of worth. Servants and masters lived in the same house, but belonged to different worlds separated by walls, by laws, and by silence. As you stand in that great hall, your stomach empty, your arms aching, you understand. To be a servant was to live at the edge of visibility, always present, never acknowledged. The masters feasted, the servants endured. That was the unshakable law of the medieval world. Not all servants lived the same life, though none lived an easy one. Within the walls of a great household, duties were divided, each role demanding, each one a chain in the endless cycle of labor. In the kitchens, the scullery maids toiled where the air was thick with smoke and grease. Their hands were cracked from scouring blackened pots as big as barrels. Their clothes smelled permanently of ash, onions, and sweat. Near them worked the cooks and their assistants, balancing knives, fire, and the constant fear of burning a dish and facing the mastery's wrath if a feast was ruined. In the bedchambers, chambermaids scrubbed floors, beat dust from straw mattresses, and aired linens that were heavy with the smell of sweat and sickness. They polished furniture until their backs ached and their fingers bled, and still the masters might notice only a speck of dust. Down in the stables, stable boys braved horses far stronger than themselves. They shoveled muck, carried heavy water buckets, and risked broken bones each time a startled animal kicked. Their reward was not respect, but a constant stench of manure that clung to their skin. Pages and errand boys ran endlessly, carrying messages, fetching items, dashing from one side of the estate to the other. They were young, often children, trained in obedience more than skill. Their feet were always blistered, their voices always silent unless spoken to. Even in the great halls, footmen and butlers moved with stiff precision. They stood for hours, waiting motionless until the lord needed wine or the lady needed her cloak. Their work was lighter than the scullery maids or the stable boys, but the pressure was heavier. A slip of the tongue, a clumsy gesture, could mean humiliation in front of everyone. Every servant's role was different, but none were free. Each task came with hardship, each position with its own brand of suffering. Whether your hands reeked of soap, smoke, or sweat, the truth was the same. You were there not to live, but to serve. And as we move deeper into this life, one question lingers. No matter your duty, how long could you endure before your body or your spirit gave way? When the day's endless labor finally ended, you might imagine that a servant could retreat to a quiet, comfortable bed. But comfort was for the masters. For the servant, sleep was yet another test of endurance. Most servants did not have private rooms. Privacy itself was a luxury reserved for nobility. Instead, you and others, like you slept, where space allowed on rushes spread across the floor of a drafty corridor, on a pile of straw tucked behind the kitchen, or in a cramped loft above the stables, the air thick with the reek of manure and hay. The straw that made your bed was alive with more than just discomfort. Lice and fleas thrived there, biting through the night, crawling into your clothes, your hair, your very skin. You scratched until you bled, but there was no escape. Even the sheets of the masters, when they trickled down to servants, carried vermin that could not be washed away. The cold was constant. Stone walls held no warmth. In winter, you shivered until your bones ached, pulling a thin, ragged blanket tighter around you. If you were lucky, another servant slept close enough to share body heat. If unlucky, you simply endured, your teeth chattering until exhaustion claimed you. There was no silence either. The household never truly slept. Horses stomped in the stables. Rats scurried across beams. The cry of an infant, the slam of a door, or the harsh call of a master might rip you from your fragile dreams at any hour. Even as you tried to rest, duty could summon you back to your feet. And so, sleep for a servant was not rest. It was a pause. A thin, uneasy gap between one day's torment and the next. You never woke refreshed, only reminded that the cycle had begun again. This was the servant's bed, straw, stench, and the constant weight of exhaustion. And it was here, in the cold and the dark, that you learned the hardest truth of all, that even your dreams were not entirely your own. The night never felt long enough. Your body still aches from yesterday's burdens. Your eyes sting from too little sleep. But before the cock crows, before the first streaks of dawn pierce the horizon, you are already awake. Not because you want to be, but because you must. Servants rose earlier than everyone else. The masters would not stir until the sun crept through the windows, but their comfort depended on hours of unseen labor. Fires had to be rekindled, floors swept, water hauled, food prepared. All this had to be ready before the household above even rubbed sleep from their eyes. So you rise in the cold. The straw clings to your clothes, your hair still tangled from restless sleep. The air bites at your skin. Your breath hangs in pale mist. No lamp lights your way unless you risk wasting precious tallow. Instead, you shuffle in near darkness, guided by memory, by habit, by the fear of being late. Your first task might be fetching water. The well lies outside, and the bucket feels heavier with each step. In winter, the rope freezes stiff, the water shocks your hands numb. Sometimes, the well itself freezes over, and you must hack at the ice before you can draw even a drop. Or perhaps you are sent to the kitchen, where the hearth has gone cold. You crouch before the ashes, coaxing a reluctant spark back to life. Smoke fills your lungs, your eyes water, your fingers blacken with soot. And still, the fire must burn bright before the masters awaken, or the cook's wrath will fall on you. No servant could linger in bed. To oversleep was to risk punishment mockery at best, a beating or dismissal at worst. In a life where survival depended on service, losing your place meant hunger, homelessness, perhaps death. And so, before the sun has even risen, you are already weary. The day stretches ahead, long and merciless. And though your body longs for more sleep, you remind yourself of the truth. For a servant, rest is not a right. It is a stolen moment, gone before it begins. The first light of dawn barely brushes the horizon, yet your hands are already raw with labor. Morning is not gentle for a servant. It is a storm of chores that must all be completed before the masters even rise from their feather beds. The fires come first. Every hearth in the house must be blazing before breakfast. You kneel before cold ashes, coaxing sparks with aching fingers. The smoke clings to your lungs, stinging your eyes until they water. In some rooms, the wood is damp, and you spend long minutes blowing until your chest heaves, your face blackened with soot. Still, the fire must burn bright warmth waiting for those who never strike a flint themselves. Then comes the water, endless, heavy buckets drawn from wells or carried from streams. You trudge back and forth across stone floors until your shoulders throb and your arms tremble. Each drop is precious, yet always insufficient. Water for cooking, water for washing, water to fill basins, so the masters may rinse their hands in luxury. The floors demand attention next. Rushes laid down months ago are foul with droppings, scraps, and insects. You sweep, bend, and scrub until your back feels ready to snap. Chamber pots, too, must be emptied foul, heavy things carried outside before their stench offends the household. No matter how tired you are, this cannot wait. All the while, the clock of duty ticks louder. Each task must be done quickly, perfectly, and invisibly. If a master stirs before the fires are lit, if the floors are still dirty, if the water is late, the blame falls on you. And as you drag a brush across the stone or pour water into a basin, you feel the weight of the day pressing down. The sun has only just risen, yet already you are spent. The masters still sleep, wrapped in comfort, while you have labored as though a full day has already passed. For a servant, the morning was not the beginning of the day. It was a race against time, one you could never truly win. Just when you think you've caught a breath, the sound comes. A sharp, metallic clang echoes through the stone halls, the servant bell. Its ring is small, but its power is immense. With that sound, your world shifts. In grand households, each important room had a bell connected by wire or rope to the servants' quarters. A gentle tug from a master's hand would send it ringing, summoning you like a dog to heel. Each bell had its place, its pitch, its command. You had to know them all by heart. The dining hall bell, the chamber bell, the library bell. At any moment, day or night, one might call, and you had to answer immediately. The bells created a rhythm of anxiety. You never truly relaxed, never truly rested, because the next ring could come at any time. A servant's body was not their own. It was bound by invisible strings to those bells, ready to jerk into motion the instant they demanded. Sometimes the call was for something trivial, a misplaced glove, a refill of wine, a curtain drawn against the sun. At other times, the summons meant endless errands, heavy lifting, or humiliation before guests. The importance of the task did not matter. What mattered was obedience. Fail to respond quickly enough, and punishment followed. A sharp rebuke in front of others. A docked wage if you were lucky enough to earn one. Perhaps even dismissal. A fate worse than a whipping, for it left you jobless, homeless, and vulnerable. And so you lived with your ears trained, always half listening for the clang. It ruled your steps, your thoughts, your heartbeat. Even in sleep, you dreamed of bells, waking at the faintest sound. The masters may not have known your name, but they knew they could command your life with a flick of the wrist. A world away from freedom, you are tethered by sound alone, bound to service not by chains of iron, but by the unyielding echo of those little brass bells. The fires are blazing now, the water drawn, the floors swept clean. At last, the household begins to stir. For the masters, morning means ease a slow yawn, a warm basin waiting by the bed, clothes laid out by careful hands. For you, it means another round of labor, this time in the kitchen. The cook, already red-faced from the heat, barks orders. Platters of bread, wheels of cheese, pots of porridge bubble over the flames. The smell is rich and tempting, and your stomach twists with hunger. But the food is not for you. It must be arranged on trays, carried upstairs, placed before the masters as though it had appeared by magic. Their table is spread with choice. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, butter and honey, perhaps even meat or eggs, rare luxuries for breakfast. They dine slowly, sipping wine or spiced ale, while you and the others hover nearby, ready to refill a goblet or clear a plate the moment they are done. Your own breakfast is something very different. If you are lucky, you may be allowed to eat the hard crusts, the burnt edges, the scraps that fall aside. More often, you wait until the masters have finished, and then gather what little remains, a slice of bread gone stale, a spoonful of porridge scraped from the pot. Sometimes there is nothing left at all. Your body already aches from hours of work, yet you press on, fueled by little more than hunger and duty. Servants were expected to work first and eat later, and if later never came, you simply endured. The divide is stark. The masters eat to excess, pushing aside food that could sustain you for days. You, the one who fetched the water, tended the fire, and carried the trays, must survive on crumbs. And as your stomach growls quietly in the shadows, you learn the unspoken law of the household. Your labor feeds the masters, but your hunger is your own burden to bear. If the grand hall was the stage for noble life, the kitchen was the battlefield where servants fought their daily war. Step inside, and the first thing that hits you is the heat. Even in the dead of winter, the kitchen blazes like summer, with fires roaring in wide stone hearths, spits turning heavy slabs of meat, and cauldrons bubbling over open flames. The air is thick with smoke and grease. Your eyes sting, your lungs burn. The floor is slick with spills ale, broth, fat dripping from roasted joints, and one careless step could send you tumbling into disaster. Yet there is no time for caution. Orders fly from the cook's mouth like arrows. Stir this, chop that, fetch more wood, faster, faster. The work never stops. You haul great pots so heavy they scald your arms when they splash. You bend over ovens, feeling your skin prickle with burns from sparks and hot coals. Knives flash dangerously close as hands move with frantic speed. Every mistake is costly. A ruined dish brings the cook's fury. A late tray invites the master's wrath. Noise fills every corner. The clatter of pans, the crackle of fire, the bellow of commands. It is chaos given rhythm, and you are caught in its grip. Servants dart past one another, balancing trays, tripping over dogs waiting for scraps, dodging blows from a master's impatient cane if the feast is delayed. The smells are almost cruel. Rich scents of roasting meat, spiced stews, fresh bread luxuries, your stomach will never truly taste. Hunger gnaws at you even as you serve, the aromas taunting, reminding you that the labor of your body creates pleasures reserved for others. And when the masters sit at their table, laughing and feasting, you remain in the inferno, sweating, gasping, laboring still. The kitchen does not rest until every plate is cleared, every pot scrubbed, every fire dampened. To be a servant in the kitchen was to live inside a storm always hot, always loud, always dangerous. And yet, for all your labor, you are never more than a shadow at the edge of someone else's feast. Not every chore carried the heat of the kitchen. Some brought the opposite, a biting cold that sank into your bones. Few tasks were more dreaded than the endless cycle of washing clothes by hand. There were no machines, no soap powders, no easy basins with warm water. Servants dragged heavy garments to streams, wells, or large wooden tubs where icy water waited year-round. In winter, the water was so cold it burned like fire, numbing your fingers until they could scarcely move. In summer, it was still heavy, still filthy, still endless. The fabrics themselves were coarse, stiff with sweat, mud, and food stains. Nobles draped themselves in silks and velvets, but beneath those fineries were layers of linen that had to be scrubbed clean, and it was your aching arms that did the scrubbing. You beat cloth against rocks, rubbed it with harsh lye soap that cracked the skin of your hands, and wrung out fabric until your joints screamed. The smell was foul. Stains of wine, grease, or worse clung stubbornly, refusing to lift. Chamber linens and undergarments were the worst of all, filthy with things no servant wanted to touch, yet touch them you must, and the masters never saw this labor. They only saw the fresh, white cloth folded neatly, as though it had never known dirt. Drying was another burden. You hauled dripping bundles into courtyards or strung them on lines, then prayed for sun. A sudden rainstorm meant all the work was ruined, and you would begin again. By day's end, your skin was raw, your nails torn, your knuckles bleeding. The chill lingered deep inside your bones, and yet more laundry always waited. For the nobles changed their clothes often, and every change meant another heap for you to scour. To wash clothes was not just a chore, it was a battle between your body and the elements. And no matter how much pain it caused, no matter how much you suffered, the cloth had to be spotless. Because the masters never noticed the effort, only the failure. A medieval household could not function without two things, water and fire. And it was the servant's burden to supply both, endlessly, without pause. Water was life. Masters needed it for washing, for cooking, for brewing, for bathing. But there were no pumps, no taps, no pipes to make it easy. Every drop had to be carried by hand. You hauled heavy buckets from the well, or trudged long paths to streams, shoulders groaning beneath the weight. The buckets sloshed and spilled, soaking your clothes, turning the earth to mud beneath your feet. You made the trip again and again, sometimes dozens of times a day. Wood was warmth. Without it, fires went out, kitchens fell silent, rooms froze. But gathering wood was more than snapping a twig here and there. It meant lifting great logs, chopping them into pieces, stacking them neatly, then carrying armful after armful into the house. The wood left splinters in your palms, bruises on your arms, welts across your back. The work was endless, and the demands never ceased. Masters expected steaming baths, roaring fires, boiling kettles, and each required more wood, more water, more sweat. No one cared if your shoulders buckled under the strain. No one cared if your hands blistered raw. The fires must burn. The basins must be full. Sometimes the tasks overlapped. You staggered in with water, just as the cook demanded more wood. You dropped the logs by the hearth, only to be ordered back to the well. The rhythm of your day was a pendulum, swinging between one burden and the next. There was no pride in this work, no recognition, only exhaustion. You might haul more in a day than your master ever lifted in a lifetime, yet you remained unseen, except when the water was late, or the firewood too damp, or the hearth too dim. Then you were seen only to be scolded. And as you trudged through mud with yet another bucket, or stumbled under the weight of a log, you felt the truth pressing down. You were not simply carrying wood and water. You were carrying the entire household on your back. Among all the endless chores of a servant, few were more degrading or more hated than the chamber pot. Before modern plumbing, before pipes and sewers, every noble household relied on these simple, stinking vessels. And it was the servant's duty to empty them. Each morning, after fires were lit and water fetched, you would creep into bedchambers with a bucket in hand. The master still dozing, the air heavy with stale scents of food, wine, and sleep, and beneath the bed, the chamber pot waiting. Heavy, foul, brimming with the waste of the night. You lifted it carefully, praying it didn't slosh or spill. One misstep, one unlucky splash, and the filth clung to your clothes, your hands, your very skin. There was no glove, no protection, no barrier between you and the stink. And if your face twisted in disgust, if you wrinkled your nose, you risked the master's fury. How dare a servant show such disrespect? The journey outside was long. Down the stairs, across the courtyard, to the midden heap or cesspit where waste was dumped. The stench there was worse still, a choking cloud of rot and decay that clung to your lungs. You emptied the pot, gagging, and carried it back to scrub clean, ready for use again. And it wasn't just one. Every room in a large household had a chamber pot. Dozens might wait each morning, lined up like grim soldiers, each one demanding to be emptied. Some days it seemed the entire house flowed with nothing but filth, and you were the one expected to carry it away. No task reminded you more brutally of your place. The nobles feasted, drank, and slept in comfort, while you bore the indignity of their most private needs. You were invisible when the food was laid, unseen when the fires burned, but in this task you were made painfully aware. Your life was bound to their waist. And when the chore was done, when your hands were raw from scrubbing, the smell still lingered. It clung to your skin, your hair, your very clothes. No matter how hard you worked, no matter how clean you left the pots, the stink of servitude followed you everywhere. The stables were no gentler than the kitchens or chambers. To serve among horses was to live in constant danger, surrounded by beasts far stronger, heavier, and less forgiving than any human master. At dawn, the stable boy or girl was already at work. The air was thick with the smell of hay, dung, and sweat. Hooves clattered, nostrils flared, and teeth snapped in the half-light. Horses were valuable, prized by lords for hunting, for travel, for war. But to you, they were daily hazards, towering, restless creatures that could kill with a single kick. The labor was endless. You hauled water buckets almost as heavy as yourself, dragged hay bales across the floor, shoveled piles of muck until your back ached. You brushed coats until your arms went numb, polished saddles and bridles until they gleamed. Each task demanded strength, speed, and silence. And always there was risk. A startled horse could rear, trampling whatever lay in its path. A swift kick to the chest, the ribs, the skull, and many a servant's life ended in those dim stables, buried without even a marker. Yet fear was no excuse. The animals had to be fed, groomed, and ready the moment the master called for a ride. The cold made the work harder still. In winter, water froze in buckets, fingers numbed to the bone, yet you still led the horses out to stretch their legs. In summer, flies swarmed in clouds, biting both beast and servant until your skin was raw. There was no season of ease, no hour of respite. And though you kept the horses sleek and strong, though your care preserved the pride of the master, you received no share of that pride. To him, the horse was worth more than the one who fed it. The beast might be praised, clothed in fine tack, and sheltered in a clean stall, while you slept on straw in a drafty corner, unwashed and unvalued. Tending horses was not only grueling, it was a reminder. In the eyes of your master, you ranked below the very animals you cared for. Not all labor chained you to the house. Often, the master or cook sent you beyond the walls, into the muddy streets and crowded markets, to fetch food and supplies. On the surface, it may have seemed a lighter duty walking under the open sky instead of scrubbing floors or hauling logs. But the market was no relief. It was another burden, heavy on your shoulders and harsher on your body. The trip began early. A purse of coins pressed into your hand, a strict list of items rattled off by the cook, and the sharp warning, don't lose a penny, don't return late. With that, you set out on foot, no matter the weather. In summer, the dust and stink of animals choked your lungs. In winter, mud swallowed your boots and froze your toes until you could barely walk. The marketplace itself was chaos. Merchants shouted, hawking their goods. Carts rattled by. Chickens flapped loose between stalls. You pushed through crowds, clutching your master's money tight, knowing that even the smallest mistake, a wrong purchase, a miscounted coin, a stolen purse, could cost you dearly. Then came the hardest part, the return. Laden with sacks of grain, baskets of vegetables, or heavy jugs of ale, you trudged back to the manor, each step a battle. The weight dug into your shoulders, strained your arms, and bent your spine. Miles felt like leagues, especially with the fear that something might spill, break, or spoil before you arrived. And when you did finally stagger through the door, sweat-soaked and aching, there was no thanks, no pause for rest. The goods were snatched away, inspected and judged. If the bread was too stale, if the apples too bruised, if a coin seemed missing, you bore the blame, no matter the truth. Fetching groceries was not a pleasant errand. It was a test of endurance, of honesty, of survival in the eyes of masters who never lifted a basket themselves. A market might seem lively to an outsider, but for a servant, it was simply another battlefield, and one you could never afford to lose. To be a servant was to live in a strange contradiction. You were expected to be invisible, silent, discreet, never drawing attention. And yet, every move you made was watched, judged, and remembered. In the grand halls, you stood at the edges of vision, tray in hand, posture stiff. Your presence was not to interrupt the laughter of the masters or the murmurs of their guests. You existed only to serve. Speak out of turn, cough too loudly, or even allow your gaze to linger too long, and sharp eyes would catch you. A rebuke would follow, perhaps in front of everyone. Even in the kitchen, under the rule of the cook, your steps were measured. Spill a pot, slice a finger, or move too slowly, and the household's whispers would spread your incompetence. Servants lived and died by reputation, and one mistake could stain yours forever. The masters often claimed not to see you. They dined, laughed, and lived as though food and wine appeared by magic, as though fires lit themselves. But in truth, they noticed everything, especially when something went wrong. A tray brought late, a garment folded imperfectly, a chamber pot left unemptied. Your labor was invisible, but your failures were magnified. This constant surveillance gnawed at the spirit. You learned to move quietly, to hold your breath, to vanish into shadows. You became skilled at silence, at obedience, at anticipating a command before it was spoken. It was not just work, it was performance, a theater where the audience judged you without ever clapping. And in the stillness of night, when you finally collapsed onto your straw bed, you felt the eyes still upon you, haunting you in memory. For a servant was never truly unseen. You were always there, always measured, always at risk. If one law governed the life of a servant, it was this: obey without question. Words, actions, even thoughts were bound to the will of the master. A command could be as small as fetching a cloak or as great as preparing an entire feast. It did not matter if you were exhausted, ill, or in pain. It did not matter if the task was unreasonable, humiliating, or impossible. Your duty was to obey. Always. To talk back was unthinkable. A sharp retort, a protest, even a hesitation could cost you dearly. At best, you might face scolding or shame in front of others. At worst, you risked being struck, dismissed, or cast into the streets with nothing. For a servant, survival depended on silence. Even when masters were cruel or unjust, you bowed your head. You learned to bite your tongue when scolded for mistakes that were not your own. You nodded at orders that contradicted one another, rushing to please both sides, though it was impossible. You bowed deeper, spoke softer, and erased yourself in service. This obedience seeped into your very body. You learned to stand still for hours without complaint. You trained your voice to be quiet, deferential, never rising above a whisper. You taught your face to hide anger, grief, or hunger, because even an expression could be seen as defiance. For some, obedience became second nature. They forgot the sound of their own laughter, the shape of their own will. For others, it was a daily torment, a constant swallowing of pride until nothing remained but silence. And yet, without obedience, there was no life at all. The streets were full of those who had talked back dismissed servants, begging for bread, wandering with no protection, no place to sleep, no future. You saw them sometimes, shadows of what might become of you. And you reminded yourself, better to bend than to break. So you obeyed, not because you wanted to, not because you respected every order, but because obedience was the only chain that kept you alive. It was not enough to obey. You had to obey properly. Every gesture, every movement, every word was bound by rules designed to remind you of your place. This was the cruel dance of servant etiquette. You never spoke first. Your voice existed only in reply, and even then it was soft, deferential, barely audible unless asked to repeat. You did not look a master in the eyes. To do so was boldness, even insolence. Instead, you kept your gaze lowered, your body slightly bent, as though your very shape had to shrink in their presence. When summoned, you hurried, but not too fast, lest you appear clumsy or desperate. When presenting food, you bowed as you set the tray down, retreating quickly so your shadow would not linger over the meal. When helping a lady dress, your hands moved delicately, but your eyes never lifted toward her face. Mistakes in this ritual were costly. A bowed head held too low might be mocked. A hand that trembled might draw anger. A single misstep on a polished floor, a stumble with a heavy tray, and laughter would ripple through the room, not kind, but the cruel amusement of those above you. There was even etiquette in silence. You learned how to stand still for hours, how to hold a candle without moving, how to vanish into the background until needed. You learned how to mask your hunger when food passed by, how to hide your exhaustion when your knees buckled, how to smother your coughs when smoke choked your lungs. And in all of it, there was humiliation. Every bow, every silence, every forced smile chipped away at your dignity. You became skilled not in the art of living, but in the art of lowering yourself. This etiquette did not exist to make the household run smoother. It existed to remind you, again and again, that you were lesser. That even when you worked hardest, your worth was not in your strength or skill, but in how well you could disappear into obedience. For a servant, perfection was expected but rarely possible. The work was endless, the tasks exhausting, and the demands contradictory. Sooner or later, something went wrong. A plate slipped, a fire burned low, a garment was misplaced. And when it did, punishment was swift. Some masters preferred scolding sharp words, cutting tones, insults that stung more deeply than any blow. They mocked you before guests, reducing you to laughter's butt, your dignity crumbling with every chuckle. Others were harsher, a slap across the face for being too slow, a strike with a cane or rod for spilling wine, a kick to the ribs for speaking out of turn. Bruises, welts, even broken bones were part of a servant's life, and there was little you could do but endure. To resist was to risk worse. But the most feared punishment was dismissal. To be cast out was not simply to lose work, it was to lose survival itself. A servant without a household had no roof, no food, no protection. Begging in the streets was often the only future, a slow decline into hunger and sickness. For many, dismissal was a sentence as cruel as any beating. There were subtler punishments, too. A withheld meal, a doubled workload, being forced to scrub floors until your knees bled, or to stand for hours holding a candle until your arms shook uncontrollably. Each was a reminder that your comfort, your body, your very existence belonged to the household, not to you. And yet, even in punishment, you could not show defiance. Tears had to be swallowed, anger hidden. To weep openly, to glare, to speak in protest, these were dangerous, sometimes deadly mistakes. Silence was your only shield. So you learned to live with fear. Fear of dropping, spilling, forgetting. Fear of the lash, the cane, the cold dismissal. Fear that any day might be your last within the manor walls. For in the medieval household, mistakes were not lessons, they were weapons, wielded against the powerless to keep them powerless. A servant's life was not secured by loyalty, nor by years of labor, nor even by skill. It was held by a fragile thread one that could snap at any moment. To lose your place in a household was to lose everything. And so, fear became your constant companion. Every day, you worked with dismissal hanging over you like a shadow. A single mistake could end it. A broken jug, a misplaced key, a word spoken too boldly. But sometimes it wasn't even failure that sealed your fate. A new steward, stricter than the last. A lady's whim, deciding she no longer liked the look of you. A master's quarrel, and suddenly, your years of service meant nothing. Without a household, where would you go? You had no land, no savings, no safety. Few inns welcomed servants without coin, and fewer employers hired those tainted with dismissal. The streets were full of former servants, begging for scraps, sleeping in doorways, their bodies hollow from hunger. You saw them sometimes when fetching goods, and their eyes met yours with a silent warning. This could be you. A fear crept into every task. You polished the same goblet 3 times, just to be sure it shone. You bowed deeper than needed, just to avoid offense. You worked through fever, through aching limbs, because to rest was to risk being seen as weak. And yet, even obedience was no guarantee. Servants were property of circumstance, dismissed for reasons they could not control. A noble family's finances faltered? Servants were caught. A marriage dissolved? Entire households changed hands, and loyal workers were cast aside. So you lived each day with the gnawing thought, tomorrow I could be gone. No matter how hard you scrubbed, how quickly you obeyed, how deeply you bowed, the fear remained. It pressed down in the silence of night, kept you from sleep, and reminded you that you are never safe. For a servant, survival was not only about enduring labor and cruelty. It was about clinging desperately to your place, knowing it could vanish in an instant, and with it, the fragile thread that held your life together. Every task left its mark on the body. The kitchen scorched your skin with stray sparks and boiling pots. The stables bruised you with trampling hooves and snapping teeth. The laundry cracked your hands until they bled, while hauling buckets bent your back into early ruin. A servant's body was a map of injuries, each scar a story of labor. Blisters were constant companions. Shoes, if you had them, were stiff and ill-fitted, cutting into your feet as you trudged across stone floors or muddy roads. Your palms split open from ropes and buckets. Your knees swelled from endless scrubbing. Small hurts never healed, for there was never rest enough. Burns were worse. The kitchen fires showed no mercy. A slip of the hand and hot grease spat onto your arm, searing the flesh. A cauldron tipped, scalding your legs. The cook might scold you for clumsiness, but no one offered ointment. No one wrapped the wound. You worked on, the pain your own burden. And bones those broke too. A tumble down the stairs carrying a tray. A horse's sudden kick. A heavy log dropping on your foot. In the world of the master, these accidents were inconveniences, not tragedies. A servant unable to work was a servant replaced. Crutches, splints, or healing herbs were rarely spared for you. Doctors existed, but their care was for nobles, not servants. The wealthy sought remedies, prayers, and potions, while you were left with superstition and willpower. A fellow servant might bind your hand with cloth, whisper a prayer, or smear herbs stolen from the garden. But often, infection set in. Cuts swelled, fevers burned, and too many servants slipped quietly into graves before their time. Pain became part of daily life. You learned to carry trays with burned hands, to walk on blistered feet, to bow while your back screamed with injury. No one applauded your endurance. It was expected, demanded, forgotten. And so the servant's body was not their own. It was a tool, used until broken. And when it broke beyond repair, it was cast aside, as though the years of labor had meant nothing at all. If exhaustion and injury did not break a servant, Disease often did. Servants lived close together, crowded into lofts, kitchens, and stables, where air was damp and smoke thick. Illness spread swiftly in such places, moving from one weary body to the next until the whole staff coughed, shivered, and staggered under fever. A simple cold could linger for weeks, made worse by poor diet and endless work. Pneumonia claimed many, their lungs filled with fluid after long days hauling water in the freezing air. Skin infections festered in wounds never treated, turning scratches into sores that swallowed flesh. Plague struck hardest of all. When sickness swept through towns and villages, nobles fled to safer country houses, leaving servants behind. Some masters carried their staff with them, but even then, the servants were the ones who tended the sick, cleaned the bedding, buried the dead. Many perished in silence, their names never recorded. The cramped sleeping quarters fueled contagion. Dozens of servants might share a single drafty room, lying shoulder to shoulder on straw. A cough in the night became a cough for all by morning. Lice and fleas crawled freely from body to body, spreading fevers and worse. Even rats carried disease through kitchens and storerooms, and servants were the first to pay the price. There was little mercy for the sick. A master might allow a servant to rest for a day, but often the work simply had to be done, whether you could stand or not. Those who collapsed at their tasks were carried away quietly, sometimes replaced before the day was done. And so sickness became another burden, endured like hunger or pain. You worked through fever, through chills, through aching bones, because to stop was to risk dismissal. The noble families prayed for their own health, but your body was left to chance, to faith, to the strength of sheer survival. For the servant, disease was not just an illness. It was a reminder that in a world where life was cheap, yours was valued least of all. A servant's stomach was rarely full. The endless labor demanded strength, yet the food to sustain it was meager, poor, and uncertain. Hunger gnawed at you morning to night, as faithful a companion as the aches in your back or the blisters on your hands. Masters feasted on roasted meats, sugared pastries, wheels of cheese, and fresh fruits brought from far-off lands. Their tables bent beneath abundance. But for servants, food was a question of scraps, what was left after the masters had eaten their fill. Often, that meant crusts of stale bread, boiled roots, thin porridge, or broth so weak it carried more water than flavor. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days, and then only if leftovers trickled down. You worked among rich aromas roasting fat, spiced wine, fresh loaves, but rarely tasted them yourself. The smell filled your nose, but not your belly. Malnutrition took its toll. Teeth rotted early. Bones grew weak. Stomachs cramped from poor fare, and bodies wasted into thinness no labor could repair. Children set to service at a young age often grew stunted, their bodies shaped more by hunger than by nature. And sometimes food simply ran out. When harvests failed, when famine swept the land, it was the servants who starved first. Masters tightened their belts, but still dined, while households quietly cut rations for the staff. Servants went to bed with empty stomachs, then woke before dawn to labor again. Hunger weakened hands, slowed steps, clouded thought, yet the work never stopped. Even as your stomach growled so loudly, it seemed the whole hall could hear. You carried trays of steaming dishes to your masters, careful not to spill. Your hunger was invisible, your suffering ignored. To be a servant was to live in the shadow of plenty, forever surrounded by food, but rarely nourished. The feast was always near enough to smell, never near enough to share. And in the silence of the night, as your belly ached and your body trembled, you understood the cruelest truth of all. Hunger was not an accident of service, it was built into it. In a world without plumbing, without running water, without the conveniences we take for granted today, cleanliness was never easy. But for servants, it was nearly impossible. And the result was something they could never escape: the smell of their own labor. Soap itself was a rarity. Good soap, scented with herbs or oils, was reserved for the wealthy. A servant might never touch such luxury in a lifetime. At best, you had harsh lye soap, rough on the skin, burning cuts and cracks in your hands until they stung. More often, you had nothing at all but cold water and a rag. Bathing was rare. You could not simply step away from duties to soak in a tub. The water had to be carried bucket by bucket, heated by fire, poured into basins, and such efforts were reserved for the master. If you were lucky, you might wash once a week, or even once a month. Often, you rinsed your face and hands quickly in a bucket before rushing back to chores, the rest of your body forgotten. The work itself made matters worse. The kitchen soaked you in smoke and grease. The stables coated you in manure and sweat. Laundry left your clothes damp and sour. Even sleep did not cleanse you, for you lay on straw alive with fleas, in rooms thick with the scent of dozens of unwashed bodies. And so, the servant's smell became part of who you were. It clung to your hair, your clothes, your skin. Masters wrinkled their noses, scolded you for being offensive, yet never spared the water, the soap, or the time that might have allowed you to be clean. You were blamed for a stench that was the product of your servitude itself. The humiliation was constant. You could not hide it. You stood in halls, serving fine food on polished silver, all while knowing that your odor betrayed you, marking you as lesser. To be a servant was to carry your status not only in your clothes and your posture, but in the very air that followed you. And still you endured. Because though the smell turned heads and invited scorn, it was the smell of survival, the smell of a life spent working, sweating, suffering in silence. In the medieval world, nobles had power, merchants had coin, even peasants had a patch of soil to claim as theirs. But servants? Servants had nothing. No rights, no voice, no shield. You belonged not to yourself, but to the household you served. The law did not stand with you. If a master struck you, humiliated you, or withheld your wages, there was no court that cared. To complain was dangerous. To speak against the hand that fed you was to invite dismissal, perhaps even prison if your master accused you of theft or insolence. Wages themselves were uncertain. Some servants were paid, but poorly, just enough to survive. Others worked only for food and shelter, their labor repaid with scraps and straw. If coin was promised and withheld, you had no power to demand it. Your word weighed nothing against that of your employer. Your body was not yours either. If summoned at midnight, you rose. If ordered to scrub floors until your hands bled, you obeyed. If commanded to fetch water in storms, or to tend fires until your skin blistered, you did so in silence. The household owned your time, your strength, even your dignity. And for women, the burden was heavier still. A chambermaid summoned to the master's bedchamber might face unspoken expectations she could not refuse. To resist was dangerous. To tell was impossible. Many carried those silent scars for life, with no justice, no acknowledgement, no escape. Even leaving service was not freedom. Without references from your master, few households would hire you. Your reputation was their property too, a leash that followed you beyond their walls. One bitter word, one accusation, and your chances of finding another place vanished. To be a servant was not just to work, it was to surrender control over your very existence. You belonged to the household, body and soul, and as long as you wore its livery, you lived not as an individual, but as an instrument of someone else's will. A grand feast was a display of power, wealth, and prestige for the master. Guests arrived in silks and jewels. The hall glittered with candles, and the tables bent beneath the weight of endless dishes. But for the servants, a feast was not celebration, it was torment, days of torment. Preparation began long before the guests arrived. Servants rose before dawn and worked late into the night, gathering food from markets, slaughtering animals, grinding grain, and hauling barrels of ale and wine. Fires had to burn hotter and longer, consuming endless stacks of wood. Kitchens, already sweltering, became infernos. The cooking itself was relentless. Whole animals, boars, deer, swans, were turned on spits for hours. Pots the size of bathtubs boiled with stews. Dozens of loaves of bread baked in the ovens, one batch after another. The air grew thick with grease and smoke, stinging your eyes, coating your skin. Mistakes were unforgivable. A dish burned, a platter dropped, a tray delayed. Each failure risked the cook's fury and the master's wrath. You carried food in endless streams, balancing heavy trays through crowded halls, bowing and retreating with perfect timing. Your arms shook, your back ached, but you dared not stumble. Even when the feast was in full swing, your labor did not end. Servants refilled goblets, cleared plates, swept away crumbs, fetched more wood for the roaring fires. Guests laughed, sang, and grew drunk while you bent lower, moved faster, smiled falsely. And when the last dish was served, the final goblet drained, the last guest gone to bed, you still were not done. The hall had to be cleared, dishes scrubbed, pots scoured until your hands were raw. By the time you finally collapsed onto your straw pallet, the first hint of dawn already touched the sky. Feasts were meant to dazzle the noble eye. But for the servant, they were trials of endurance, grinding days of sweat and smoke that left your body broken and your spirit hollow. The lords remembered the merriment, the music, the endless food. The servants remembered only exhaustion. The hall shimmered with abundance. Platters of roasted meats, steaming pies, sugared fruits, and spiced wines stretched down the long table. The lords and ladies laughed, their goblets brimming, their fingers dripping with grease and honey. The smell alone was overwhelming, rich, mouth-watering, dizzying, but none of it was for you. Servants stood along the walls, trays in hand, stomachs gnawing with hunger. You had prepared the feast, carried the trays, bent over the fires until your skin blistered, and still you watched others eat while your own belly ached. The rules were clear. The best cuts of meat, the freshest loaves of bread, the richest wines, all belonged to the masters. Only when they were finished, when their laughter had quieted and their plates were pushed aside, could servants hope for scraps. Those scraps were meager. A gnawed bone, a slice of stale bread, the cold remains of a pie. Sometimes there was nothing at all. Waste was tossed to dogs before it was offered to the hands that had labored for it. Even when food did reach the servants, it came with humiliation. You ate standing, quickly, in corners or kitchens, shoveling what you could before being summoned back to work. There was no comfort, no pause, no dignity. The feast had filled the masters, but left you hungrier still. This hierarchy of food was no accident. It was a constant reminder of your place. The nobility feasted because you toiled. You toiled so they could feast. And though your body cried out for nourishment, your hunger was considered unworthy of the table you had helped to set. To be a servant at a banquet was to smell paradise, to see abundance, to touch wealth with your own hands, and to taste only scraps, if anything at all. The divide between master and servant was never clearer than in those moments, when plenty surrounded you, but hunger remained your closest companion. When the laughter faded, when the music quieted, when the nobles stumbled off to bed with full stomachs and flushed cheeks, the servant's work was far from over. In truth, the hardest part was only beginning. The kitchen, after a feast, was a battlefield. Spits dripped with grease, ovens smoldered with ash, tables sagged under heaps of dirty platters. And at the heart of it all stood the great pot's vast iron cauldrons, so large a child could almost bathe inside them. They were heavy, blackened, and caked with the remains of stews, porridge, or boiling meats. It was your job to clean them. You scraped at hardened crust with knives, banged spoons against iron walls, scoured with handfuls of sand or ash. The smell was foul: sour milk, burnt fat, and rotting scraps clinging to the sides. Water had to be hauled again and again, poured into tubs, sloshed across the floor as you scrubbed. The weight of a single pot was enough to wrench your back, yet you lifted, tilted, and dragged them day after day. There was no quick task here. Hours could vanish into one pot alone, your arms trembling, your fingernails torn, your skin rubbed raw. Even when it gleamed again well enough for the cook's sharp eye, you knew it would only blacken once more with tomorrow's fire. And the work was not just filth. It was danger. Pots still hot from the fire could burn your hands, their iron walls searing through cloth rags. Slippery floors sent servants tumbling, buckets spilling, bruises blossoming. Accidents happened, but excuses were never accepted. When you finally crawled to bed, your hands stank of grease that no water could wash away. The nobles dreamed of their feast, and you dreamed only of scrubbing, your sleep haunted by the clang of iron and the scrape of knives against endless blackened walls. To clean pots as big as bathtubs was not simply a chore. It was a punishment in itself, a reminder that even after the nobles' pleasures ended, your labor carried on long into the night. The medieval kitchen was more than hot, more than exhausting. It was dangerous. Every corner carried risk. Every task threatened pain. For a servant, the kitchen was a place where a single careless moment could scar you for life. The fires blazed day and night. Flames licked high, sparks snapped unpredictably, and smoke choked the lungs. A sleeve too close to the hearth could ignite in an instant. Cauldrons bubbled with scalding stews, splattering your skin with burns. Logs shifted suddenly, sending embers flying. You worked with fire so often that the smell of singed hair clung permanently to you. Knives and cleavers flashed constantly. Bread was hacked, meat carved, roots chopped with relentless speed. There was no pause, no safety, only the demand for haste. Blades slipped often, slicing fingers and hands. Cuts festered, turning red and swollen without proper care. Yet you kept working, blood wrapped in dirty rags. The weight of the work added danger too. Pots big enough to feed dozens had to be lifted and moved, heavy trays balanced across crowded halls. One slip, one stumble, and boiling broth or a tray of knives might crash down on you, or worse, on a guest, a mistake punishable by more than just pain. The floor itself was an enemy. Grease, spilled ale, and water from endlessly hauled buckets made it slick. Servants darted back and forth in the rush, colliding, slipping, falling. Bones broke, teeth shattered, but the work pressed on. Accidents were not rare. They were expected. Burns, cuts, bruises, falls. These scars marked every kitchen servant, written across their skin as proof of labor. Yet the masters saw none of it. To them, the kitchen's chaos was invisible. They tasted only the result, never the danger that delivered it. To survive the kitchen was to live on the edge of injury. Every meal was bought with risk, every feast with suffering. And though the masters dined in comfort, their safety, their pleasure, their very sustenance was carved from the dangers their servants faced each day. When the bells rang and the feast was ready, the kitchen's chaos spilled into the great hall. And it was the servants who bore it on their shoulders literally. The trays were heavy, stacked with platters of steaming meat, tureens of broth, and pitchers of ale. Some trays were so large they required 2 servants to carry, each step measured, each breath held in fear. A stumble could mean disaster. A dish ruined, a guest splattered, a servant disgraced. The path was treacherous. Floors slick with rushes or spilled drink, benches jutting out, dogs prowling under tables, and drunken guests grabbing at passing servants for sport. You moved through it all like a tightrope walker, balancing weight and dignity, while laughter and chaos swirled around you. The pressure was unbearable. Nobles expected service not just swift, but graceful. A goblet must be refilled without a drop spilled, a platter placed silently before a guest, a tray whisked away before crumbs stained the cloth. To falter even slightly was to invite mockery or punishment. Your arms shook beneath the load, your back ached, sweat trickled down your spine. Yet your face had to remain calm, expressionless, as though carrying half your body's weight was effortless. The art of service was not only labor, it was theater, where the audience jeered at every mistake but never applauded the perfect act. Accidents happened often. A tray tipped, a jug slipped, a servant tripped over a dog. The hall erupted in laughter, not at the accident itself, but at the servant's humiliation. Sometimes the master joined in, scolding you publicly as though the error were a crime. The shame burned worse than the weight itself. And when the trays were finally emptied, your labor was not done. Back to the kitchen you went, arms aching, only to take up another load. Trip after trip, platter after platter, until the feast ended and the hall quieted once more. To carry heavy trays was more than physical strain. It was a performance of strength and silence, where failure meant ridicule and success meant nothing at all. For most people, the day has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are moments for labor, moments for rest, moments for leisure. But for the servant, there was no such balance. Life blurred into one long stretch of work, broken only by exhaustion. From the first bell before dawn to the last ember dying in the hearth, your body was in motion. Fires to light, floors to scrub, water to haul, meals to serve, beds to prepare. When one task ended, another began, and when that was done, still more waited. The work was a chain without a final link. There was no after work. Leisure was a word that belonged to the masters. For you, the closest thing to free time was the walk to fetch water, or a stolen breath in a shadowed corridor, or a few whispered words to another servant, while your hands never stopped moving. Even mealtimes were not your own. You ate standing, in haste, often in kitchens still smoky and hot, ready to leap up the moment a bell rang. There was no lingering over food, no laughter around the table, no chance to savor. The hunger drove you on, but the work consumed you faster. Holidays, too, were illusions. Religious festivals might bring moments of joy to the masters, but they only meant more labor for servants' larger feasts, more guests, more fires, more mess. Rarely, a master might grant a half-day of rest. But even then, the chores were not truly gone. They only piled higher for tomorrow. By the time night arrived, your body felt broken. Feet blistered, arms trembling, eyes heavy with fatigue. Yet even then, you could not collapse fully. A bell might still ring, a guest might still call, a fire might still need tending. Sleep came only when the house at last was silent, and even then, it was shallow, restless, fragile. To be a servant was not simply to work hard. It was to live without the concept of rest at all. Free time did not exist. Collapse was the only pause your body was allowed. Servants lived under constant labor, but they also lived under constant watch. Every action was measured, every word overheard. And nowhere was this more cruelly felt than in matters of the heart. Love for a servant was dangerous. Courtship distracted from duty. Whispers in dark corners were seen as idleness. A smile held too long might draw suspicion. Masters demanded obedience, not only in labor, but in spirit. Your affection, your loyalty, your time all were expected to belong to the household, not to another servant. Yet human hearts cannot be ordered so easily. In the kitchens, as you worked side by side, sparks might pass between glances. In the stables, a joke shared in exhaustion might grow into something deeper. Friendships bloomed in stolen moments, while hauling buckets, while scrubbing floors, while standing together in silence after the day's labor finally ended. But secrecy was vital. A romance discovered could mean dismissal, shame, or worse. For women, the danger was heavier still. A child conceived in service might ruin both mother and child, costing them their place, their livelihood, their survival. Even friendships were fragile. Masters discouraged bonds among servants, fearing they might lead to rebellion or gossip. Rivalries were encouraged instead, each servant pitted against another for approval, scraps of privilege, or lighter tasks. To trust someone was a risk. To confide was dangerous. And yet, without those small bonds, the servant's life was unbearable. So love and friendship survived in whispers, in stolen smiles, in quick touches of hands passing in the dark, in quiet words exchanged before sleep. Fragile, fleeting, but precious. They were sparks of humanity in a world designed to grind humanity away. For servants, love was forbidden, friendship discouraged. But still, both endured, because even in the harshest lives, the heart sought warmth where it could. A servant's life was not only shaped by masters. It was shaped by those who worked beside you, your fellow servants. In the crowded kitchens, the drafty corridors, and the cramped sleeping lofts, bonds were formed. But so too were rivalries, jealousies, and endless gossip. Servants lived close, but competition ran deep. Each fought for favor, for lighter tasks, for the rare word of praise from a master. A chambermaid who folded linens more neatly might be noticed and trusted with finer work. A stable boy who kept the horses gleaming might be granted small privileges. And every promotion, however small, meant someone else was left behind. This competition bred whispers. Servants spoke in low voices, telling tales of who had angered the cook, who had spilled wine in the hall, who might be dismissed soon. Rumors spread like wildfire, stoked by boredom and resentment. Gossip became both entertainment and weapon, used to cut rivals down, or to curry favor with higher servants like stewards or housekeepers. Friendships existed, but trust was fragile. A careless word could be twisted into betrayal. A secret, once shared, might be used against you. Many learned to keep their hearts guarded, their tones still, speaking only in riddles or whispers when the night grew quiet. And yet, gossip was also survival. Through it, you learned which master was in a foul mood, which tasks would be most dangerous, which fellow servant might help you or hinder you. It was both lifeline and poison. The rivalries sometimes flared into open conflict, shoves in the scullery, arguments in the yard, even brawls behind the stables when tempers burned too hot. But more often, they simmered quietly, shaping the invisible hierarchy within the servant world. The masters rarely noticed or cared how servants tore at one another, but perhaps that was the point. A household divided by whispers and rivalry was a household less likely to unite, less likely to rebel. So the gossip flowed, the rivalries sharpened, and the servants lived caught in a web of their own, making both companions and competitors, bound together by labor, yet divided by survival. For the masters, holidays were days of joy. Feasts, music, church processions, and celebrations filled the calendar with color and sound. But for the servant, holidays were not freedom. They were only more work, dressed in brighter clothes. On great feast days, Easter, Christmas, saints' days, the household swelled with guests. Nobles from nearby manors arrived in carriages. Clergy came to dine. Neighbors crowded the halls. More mouths to feed, more goblets to fill, more rooms to clean. What was leisure for the master became doubled labor for the servant. The kitchen blazed hotter, cooks shouted louder, and errands multiplied. You carried water until your arms trembled, balanced trays until your spine bent, scrubbed floors until your knees felt broken. The celebrations above glittered with music and laughter, but below, the servants sweated in silence. Sometimes a master granted a small gift, a coin, a scrap of cloth, or the chance to attend church. For a few hours, you might stand in a crowded chapel, breathing incense instead of smoke, hearing hymns instead of orders. Yet even then, duty pressed at your shoulders. You hurried back as soon as the service ended, fearing to be late, fearing to displease. On the rarest occasions, servants were allowed half a day's rest, especially at midsummer festivals or village fairs. But even then, the time was not your own. You were watched, warned to behave, reminded that your conduct reflected on your household. Joy was permitted only in measure, always under the eye of authority. And when night came and the masters retired from their merriment, the servants still worked on, cleaning the mess, dousing the fires, scrubbing the stains left by revelry. The masters awoke to memories of celebration. The servants awoke to exhaustion. Holidays for the masters were glittering escapes from duty. For the servants, they were reminders that even on days of joy, the chains of service never loosened. To the master, a servant's time was never their own. Even in the rarest moments, when work slowed, when fires burned steadily, and no bells rang, the shadow of control lingered. Leisure was not freedom, it was permission, granted or withdrawn at a whim. If you sat too long, you risked rebuke. Idleness was a sin in the eyes of nobles, though they themselves spent hours in games, hunts, or conversation. A servant resting was seen as lazy, ungrateful, or insolent. Even when a task was finished, another could always be found. Dust to sweep, shoes to polish, wood to chop. Reading, if you were literate at all, was discouraged. Books belonged to the masters, and knowledge was considered dangerous in the hands of those who served. Laughter, music, or games among servants were tolerated only in whispers, for joy looked suspicious when born from those meant to labor. Masters sometimes allowed small tokens of leisure and evening at the village fair, a visit to family, a short walk beyond the manor walls. But these were favors, not rights, easily revoked. A single mistake could mean your next request was denied. Your freedom was always borrowed, never owned. Even at night, when work was done, the control remained. You slept where you were told, rose when commanded, and could be summoned at any hour. The hours you thought of as your own might vanish with the sudden clang of a bell or the sharp call of a steward. So servants learned to make leisure in the smallest cracks of time. A whispered story told by firelight, a quiet song hummed while scrubbing floors, a shared crust of bread passed in the yard. These were the moments that gave life meaning, fragile though they were. But always you remembered. Your body, your voice, your time all belonged to the household. Even your laughter required permission. When the household finally quieted, when the fires dimmed and the nobles drifted into sleep, the servant's day did not always end. For some, the night brought another burden, guard duty. The great houses and castles of the medieval world were never truly safe. Thieves, raiders, and rival lords threatened from without. Fire, accident, and betrayal threatened from within. And so, servants were ordered to keep watch, pacing halls and courtyards long after their bodies begged for rest. The darkness was heavy, broken only by a flickering torch or the pale glow of the moon. The stone walls leached the heat from your bones, and the night air gnawed at your fingers until they went numb. Wrapped in thin rags, you stamped your feet to keep the blood flowing, but still the cold crept deeper, biting, unrelenting. The silence was deceptive. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves, every distant howl of a dog set your nerves on edge. You strained your ears for sounds of danger, heart quickening at shadows that often turned out to be nothing. Fear was as much your companion as the cold, and yet, even in vigilance, the risk of failure loomed. To nod off, even for a moment, could mean punishment or disaster if harm befell the household while you slept. Masters never considered the exhaustion that weighed on your eyelids after a day of ceaseless labor. To them, a servant's duty had no limit, no pause. So you walked the halls until your legs felt hollow. You clutched the torch until your arm ached. You prayed for dawn, not for warmth or food, but simply to be released from the cold grip of night. Guard duty was not honor. It was not trust. It was another way the servant's body was used, one more night stolen from sleep, one more reminder that your life was never your own. Guard duty in a manor was wearying enough. But in a castle, the night watch became something harsher, heavier, a burden mixed with fear. Castles were fortresses, and with their stone towers, narrow staircases, and endless shadows, danger was everywhere. You walked the battlements under the moon, the wind howling through arrow slits, tugging at your clothes, numbing your skin. Below stretched forests or villages cloaked in darkness, places where bandits lurked or enemy scouts crept. Every rustle in the distance, every echo of hooves set your heart racing. Were they friends, foes, or phantoms born from your own exhaustion? Inside, the halls were no safer. Castles were sprawling, filled with twisting stairwells, storage rooms, and chambers that swallowed light. Rats scurried across floors, owls hooted from towers, and sometimes the silence itself pressed against your ears until it felt like a weight. It was said that ghosts of the dead lingered in these walls, slain knights, betrayed lords, servants who had died unnamed. In the dead of night, their whispers seemed to echo in the stone. Yet ghosts were the least of your worries. Real threats prowled, too. Fire could spark from an untended torch, smoke filling corridors before anyone stirred. Raiders sometimes struck in the night, scaling walls, setting chaos loose within. And then there was the danger of the castle itself. A misstep on a staircase, a fall from the wall, a stumble carrying a torch through narrow halls. The masters slept safely in their chambers, heavy doors bolted, warm under furs. But your safety rested on nothing more than your own weary eyes and stiffening body. A servant on night watch was expendable. If danger came, you were the first to face it, the first to fall. To survive the night in a castle was to live in constant tension, every sound amplified, every shadow alive. And when the dawn finally broke, you dragged your body back down into daylight, knowing the labor of the new day waited without pity. For the nobles, a castle was a symbol of strength. For the servants who watched through its long nights, it was a prison of stone, filled with peril at every turn. When the bell rang from a master's chamber at night, every servant felt a chill. To be summoned in those hours was different, more intimate, more dangerous, more unpredictable. The bedchamber was the heart of privacy, and stepping inside it as a servant meant stepping into a world of silent fear. Sometimes the summons was ordinary. A candle needed trimming, a fire needed tending, a basin of water fetched. You entered quietly, head bowed, moving like a shadow, so as not to disturb the master's comfort. The slightest sound, the smallest mistake, could draw irritation or anger. But not all summons were so simple. A master, restless with drink, might demand food or wine, keeping you on your feet long after midnight. A lady, troubled in the night, might require company, a whispered prayer, or a handmaiden's attendance until sleep returned. For these you obeyed, tired though you were, because refusal was unthinkable. Worse still were the unspoken summons, the ones every servant dreaded. A noble might call for a chambermaid not for service, but for satisfaction. To resist was perilous, to complain impossible. Many endured in silence, their dignity stripped, their pain carried in secret. For women especially, the bedchamber summons could become a lifelong scar. Even in less sinister moments, the fear lingered. You were intruding into the most private space of those who held complete power over you. Their clothes, their letters, their moods, all were laid bare, and you were expected to pretend you saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. When at last you retreated, closing the heavy door behind you, relief mixed with exhaustion. But the dread never left, for you knew the bell could ring again at any hour. The bedchamber was the master's sanctuary. For the servant, it was a place of anxiety, humiliation, and helplessness, a reminder that even in the most private hours of night, Your body and your time were never your own. As the day ended and the household quieted, the masters prepared for their most private luxury sleep. But even this required servants to labor, shaping comfort for others while knowing they themselves would never taste it. The first duty was fire. Bedrooms had to be warm before the master entered. You crouched before the hearth, coaxing flames to life, feeding logs until the chamber glowed. The smoke clung to your hair, your eyes watered, but the fire had to burn steady through the night. Then came the linens. Beds were stripped of their day's dust and remade with fresh sheets. Bolsters were beaten until soft, blankets smoothed and folded neatly. In noble households, fine sheets of linen or even silk were laid, stitched and washed by the same weary hands that now spread them across feather mattresses. You tucked every corner with precision, knowing a single wrinkle might draw rebuke. Clothes, too, had to be set ready for the morning. Nightshirts, slippers, or gowns were placed within reach. A basin of water was prepared for washing, a towel folded just so. The chamber pot was discreetly checked, emptied if needed, replaced clean. No detail was too small. And through it all, your presence lingered like a shadow. You were there, yet unseen, expected to vanish the moment your task was done. Masters rarely considered the intrusion you felt entering their most private space, seeing them half-dressed or in weariness, while your own privacy was non-existent. They had walls, doors, locks. You had none. When the bed was finally prepared, the master retired, slipping into warmth and softness you could scarcely imagine. You bowed, stepped back, and left in silence, returning to your own pallet of straw, fleas, and cold air. Their rest was ensured by your labor. Yours was denied by theirs. Preparing bedrooms was not simply a task. It was a ritual of contrast luxury for the master, deprivation for the servant, played out night after night, until the difference became unbearable. When the masters finally drifted into soft feather beds, surrounded by warmth, silence, and safety, the servants retreated to their own rest, or rather, to something that only faintly resembled it. Servants rarely had private chambers. Instead, they slept where space could be spared, in corridors and lofts above kitchens, on pallets stuffed with straw tucked beneath stairwells or beside doors. Their bodies lined hallways like forgotten furniture, always within reach, always ready to rise at the clang of a bell or the bark of a steward. The straw that formed their beds was thin, lumpy, and alive with fleas. Blankets, if they had any, were coarse and ragged, barely enough to keep out the cold. Drafts whistled through cracks in the stone, chilling the air until sleep became shivering. The smell of smoke, grease, and unwashed bodies hung heavy, clinging even as exhaustion pressed the eyes shut. But the greatest cruelty was not the discomfort. It was the constant interruption. A servant could never surrender fully to sleep. The scrape of footsteps in the hall, the creak of a door, the sudden toll of a bell each sound could drag you awake in an instant. At any hour, you might be summoned to fetch water, stir fires, or attend to a restless master. And so you never truly rested. You dozed lightly, one ear always open, one hand always ready to push yourself up. Dreams were shallow, scattered, often broken by the noise of rats scurrying, horses stamping, or infants crying in the chambers above. Your body was present, but your mind was never allowed to drift far. The masters, in their beds, slept deeply, confident in the safety provided by those who labored below. The servants, in their corridors, slept half awake, never safe, never comfortable, never fully human in their rest. To sleep as a servant was not to restore your body, it was only to pause it. A fragile stillness, gone as soon as duty called again. Every human heart holds dreams, visions of freedom, of love, of a life better than today. But for the medieval servant, dreams were luxuries denied. Your world was not shaped by your wishes, but by commands, by bells, by endless labor. From the moment you entered service, your path narrowed. Perhaps you were born into poverty, your parents sending you to labor in a noble house because there was no bread at home. Perhaps you were orphaned, taken in not from kindness, but because extra hands meant extra work done. For many, service began in childhood and stretched unbroken until death. What dreams could survive in such a life? To imagine freedom, you first needed time, and there was none. From dawn to night, your hours belonged to another. To imagine wealth, you first needed wages worth saving, and most never earned enough to buy even a scrap of land or a roof of their own. To imagine love, you needed privacy, choice, and safety, but those two were forbidden. And so, dreams faded. Each year, they withered a little more. The boy who once thought of adventure became the stable lad who never left the yard. The girl who once thought of family became the maid who scrubbed floors until her knees swelled. Hopes dimmed into habit, and habit hardened into chains. Some servants told themselves stories of rising through loyalty to steward or housekeeper, of marrying well, of earning a master's kindness. A few rare souls did climb higher, becoming trusted attendants or even free tradespeople. But for most, the climb never came. The ladder was broken long before they reached it. And in the silence of the night, lying half awake on straw, you felt the weight of it. Not just hunger, not just fatigue, but the emptiness of knowing that tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after the same again. A life without change, without freedom, without dreams. For the servant, survival itself was the only goal. To hope for more was to invite heartbreak. And so, most stopped hoping at all. Many servants never chose their place in the household because they began their lives there as children. Poverty drove parents to send sons and daughters into service, hoping for food, shelter, or a small wage. Others were orphans, abandoned to monasteries or noble estates where their childhood was exchanged for labor. Imagine being no more than 8 or 9 years old, small enough to still crave play and stories, yet old enough to carry water buckets, scrub floors, or tend fires. The work did not wait for you to grow stronger. It demanded your hands, your back, your obedience immediately. Children were often set to the most menial and exhausting tasks. Running errands until their feet blistered, fetching wood too heavy for their arms, crawling under tables to gather scraps or ashes. Beatings fell hardest on them, for masters believed discipline must be taught early. A child's tears were seen not as pain, but as weakness to be stamped out. There was little schooling for servant children. While noble sons studied letters, and noble daughters learned music or embroidery, the servant child learned only toil. Their world was one of brooms, buckets, and silence. Even laughter was dangerous if it drew the wrong eyes. Play, when it existed at all, was carved into slivers of stolen time, chasing one another in the yard for a few minutes, whispering stories while straw beds rustled at night, carving tiny toys from scraps of wood. These fleeting moments were rare sparks in a long gray stretch of duty. And as they grew, childhood did not lead to choice. The scullery boy became the stable lad. The errand girl became the chambermaid. What began as small chores became lifelong labor. A servant's life did not begin at adulthood. It swallowed their childhood whole. The tragedy was not only the loss of play, but the loss of possibility. These children never dreamed of becoming knights, scholars, or merchants. Their future was already written in soot and sweat. A servant's life was not just endured by adults. It was carved into children, shaping them long before they ever had a chance to shape themselves. The chronicles of the medieval world brim with the names of kings, knights, and noble ladies. Their deeds were written in illuminated manuscripts, carved in stone, sung in halls. But the names of servants, the ones who lit the fires, scrubbed the floors, and carried the burdens, rarely survived. You lived your whole life in the shadow of others, and when you died, the shadow swallowed you whole. No chronicler inked your name. No monument marked your resting place. At best, a parish register might record your baptism or burial. More often, you vanished without trace, as though you had never existed at all. This invisibility was not an accident. It was part of the servant's role. You were meant to be unseen, unnoticed, unremembered. The master's polished hall reflected his wealth, not your labor. The noble's shining armor spoke of his glory, not of the hands that cleaned and carried it. And so, loneliness lingered even beyond death. You watched nobles secure their legacy, sons inheriting lands, daughters married with dowries, portraits painted to preserve their likeness. Meanwhile, you left behind no inheritance but the faint memory of toil, passed in whispers among other servants before fading away. Even in life, this loneliness was sharp. You knew that your absence would not be mourned by the household, except as an inconvenience. If you fell ill and died, another servant would take your place within days, perhaps even hours. The fires would still be lit, the meals still prepared, the beds still made. Life went on, as though you had never been there. And yet, you longed for recognition, for someone to know that you had lived, had struggled, had endured. But history, written by the powerful, had no place for you. You were the silent foundation beneath their stories, a presence that carried weight but left no mark. The greatest cruelty of servitude was not only the labor, the hunger, or the pain. It was the loneliness of being forgotten, of knowing that when your body returned to the earth, the world would not even remember you had once been here. When the day's labor finally ended, when the pots were scoured, the fires dimmed, and the bells at last fell silent, many servants turned to the only refuge left to them, prayer. Religion was not a luxury for the poor. It was survival. The church taught that suffering on earth could earn peace in heaven. For servants who knew only hunger, pain, and obedience, this promise was the one thread of hope they could cling to. At night, lying on straw, you whispered prayers into the darkness. Your hands, cracked and raw from work, folded tightly as you begged for strength, forgiveness, or relief. You prayed for your family far away, for your health to endure another day, for your master's mood to be merciful tomorrow. Sometimes you prayed simply to be seen by God, if not by man. Small tokens of faith marked your world. A wooden cross hung above a servant's corner, a rosary made of cheap beads, a scrap of parchment with a saint's name. These objects, though humble, carried immense weight. They were reminders that someone greater watched over you, even if your masters did not. The rhythm of church bells punctuated your life as surely as servant bells did. Mass at dawn, vespers at dusk moments when you stood among peasants, merchants, and nobles alike, all kneeling on the same cold floor. For those brief minutes, you could imagine a world where status mattered less, where your voice rose in unison with others, carried upward in song and prayer. But even faith was not free. Holy days meant extra feasts, more labor. Tithes to the church carved away what little wages you earned. Priests preached obedience, urging servants to honor their masters as God's will. Still, you held on to faith, not because it eased your labor, but because it gave meaning to endurance. For in the silence of night, when hunger gnawed and exhaustion weighed, prayer was the only comfort no master could take from you. It was the whisper of hope that tomorrow might be lighter, or that if not in this life, then in the next, rest would finally come. When the bells fell silent and the master's halls grew still, servants gathered in their corners, on straw pallets, or in the dim glow of the kitchen's last embers. It was then, in the thin hours between exhaustion and sleep, that stories were born. Not grand chronicles like those sung in noble courts, but simple tales of tricksters and fools, of ghosts in the woods, of saints and sinners. Stories passed down from mothers, fathers, or fellow servants long gone. They were spoken in whispers, soft enough not to wake the household, but strong enough to stir weary hearts. Some were tales of hope dreams of a servant rising high, earning freedom, or stumbling upon hidden treasure. Others were warnings full of witches, demons, and wandering spirits, reflecting the fears that haunted the night. Many were humorous, poking fun at greedy masters or bumbling lords, a rare moment when laughter lightened the chains of obedience. Children in service listened wide-eyed, their imaginations carrying them far from soot and straw, into forests of wonder or castles of magic. Adults clung to stories too, not because they believed them, but because they offered a breath of life beyond duty. For a few minutes, as words wove pictures in the dark, you were not only a servant, you were human again, with the right to dream. These stories bound servants together. Shared whispers built trust where gossip often tore it down. A tale told tonight might be retold tomorrow by another, reshaped and carried like a spark passed hand to hand. In this way, the servant world kept its own memory alive, even when history ignored it. And when finally the voices faded and sleep pressed in, the stories lingered. They softened the straw, silenced the hunger, dulled the bruises. They carried you gently into dreams, reminding you that even in the harshest life, imagination could not be taken away. Nobles strutted through their halls as though their wealth and power were their own achievements. They spoke of bloodlines, of honor, of divine right. Yet behind every polished floor, every blazing fire, every banquet table, stood the invisible truth. Without servants, the noble life would collapse. A lord might boast of his fine armor, gleaming in the sunlight, but who polished it until it shone. A lady might glide in silks, but whose fingers stitched the seams, washed the fabric, brushed away the stains. Children of the house were praised for their manners, but it was the nursemaid, the tutor, the cook who shaped them daily. Even the most basic comforts rested on servant labor. The water in the basin each morning did not appear by magic. It was carried bucket by bucket. The warm bed at night was not eternal. It was made fresh each evening. The food on the table was not conjured. It was fetched, chopped, cooked, and served by dozens of hands. And yet, this dependence was never acknowledged. Servants were expected to vanish into the background, their contributions invisible unless something went wrong. Nobles pretended that their elegance and power flowed naturally, as though firewood split itself and floors swept themselves clean. In truth, the noble household was a theater, and servants were both stagehands and scaffolding. They built the illusions, kept the machinery moving, ensured the performance dazzled. The audience, the guests, the neighbors, the rivals saw only the glittering surface. They never saw the exhaustion beneath. The irony was cruel. Those who were most vital were treated as least important. Servants carried the household on their shoulders, yet were dismissed as shadows, their labor overlooked, their names forgotten. Strip away the servants, and the noble's world crumbled into filth, hunger, and chaos. But as long as the servants remained, unseen and unpraised, the masters believed their grandeur was theirs alone. Every great banquet, every shining castle, every noble lineage rested not only on the deeds of lords and ladies, but on the unseen labor of servants. They were the hands that scrubbed the stones, the backs that carried the loads, the voices that stayed silent while history was written by others. Servants built the stage on which medieval life unfolded. They tilled fields, baked bread, poured wine, and mended clothes. They kept fires alive in freezing winters, swept away the filth of animals and men, and bore the weight of households, too proud to acknowledge them. Without servants, the great of history could not have lived as they did. When kings marched to war, servants packed their supplies, sharpened their weapons, and tended their horses. When queens appeared in splendor, servants laced their gowns, styled their hair, and polished their jewels. When chronicles spoke of noble feasts, of alliances sealed at grand tables, it was servants who laid those tables and cleared them again. And yet, their names are absent. Records mention lords, knights, priests, but not the boy who carried water, the girl who washed linens, the cook who sweated over the fire. Entire lives of labor slipped through the cracks of history, unremembered, unseen. The world remembers cathedrals and castles, but not the calloused hands that quarried the stone, hauled the timber, mixed the mortar. It remembers battles won and lost, but not the servant who dragged supplies across muddy miles or nursed the wounded with trembling fingers. This erasure was no accident. It was the design of a society built on hierarchy. Servants were not meant to be remembered. Their value was measured in silence. Their legacy erased the moment they drew their last breath. Yet in truth, servants built the medieval world as surely as lords ruled it. Their labor laid the foundation. Their sweat kept the machine alive. History may have forgotten their names, but without them, there would be no history at all. To live as a servant was to live on a knife's edge. Every day balanced between survival and despair, between pushing forward and giving in. A single event, a mistake, an illness, a lost place could tip the scales and shatter a life beyond repair. Survival meant endurance, waking before dawn, no matter the exhaustion, hauling water with blistered hands, bowing and smiling though your stomach growled with hunger. Survival was found in small victories, a kind word from a fellow servant, a meal not reduced to scraps, a night when you managed a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. But despair was always close. Hunger gnawed until your ribs showed. Injuries festered without care. Beatings left you trembling in silence. Loneliness hollowed you from within. The knowledge that your life, your suffering, your very existence could vanish without anyone remembering. For many, despair became heavier than labor itself. Some broke under it. You saw them in the eyes of fellow servants' eyes dulled, voices flat, their bodies moving through tasks like machines. Others slipped into reckless defiance, stealing scraps of food, snapping back at a master, knowing punishment would follow, but too weary to care. Some simply disappeared, running from households, only to face hunger, prison, or death on the roads. The line between enduring and breaking was razor thin. A winter too cold, a famine too long, a punishment too cruel, and survival became impossible. And yet, so many clung on, not because life was kind, but because the human spirit, even when crushed, still struggled to rise. For the servant, every day was a negotiation with despair. You told yourself, one more hour, one more day, one more season. You prayed tomorrow might bring a gentler master, kinder work, a stroke of fortune. Hope flickered faintly, and though despair loomed always near, that flicker kept you walking the line. Cruelty was common, indifference even more so. Yet every so often, in the long years of service, a servant might glimpse something unexpected. Kindness. Small, fleeting, but powerful enough to linger in memory for a lifetime. Perhaps it was a master who noticed your exhaustion and allowed you an hour's rest. Or one who pressed a coin into your hand at Christmastide, more generous than custom required. A lady might offer you a cloak on a bitter morning, or a child of the household might sneak bread into your hands when your stomach growled. These gestures were rare, but when they came, they burned bright against the gray of daily toil. To be treated with even a moment's humanity, to be seen, if only briefly, as more than an invisible pair of hands, was like water to a parched throat. Some masters were remembered for their fairness. They scolded, but did not beat. They fed their servants decently, paid their wages honestly, and allowed small mercies when the work allowed. Under such households, the burden was still heavy, but the despair was lighter. Servants spoke of them with quiet gratitude, even years later. But even the kindest masters could never erase the divide. Their mercy was a gift, not a right. It could be withdrawn at any moment, replaced by sternness or silence. And no kindness could change the truth that you still rose before dawn, still bent your back, still lived at the mercy of another's will. Yet for many servants, these glimpses of compassion were enough to keep despair at bay. A kind word remembered, a coin saved, a meal shared, these became anchors in a sea of hardship. They proved that even in a world built on hierarchy and cruelty, humanity sometimes slipped through the cracks. And though history forgot the servants, they remembered their masters, harsh or kind, cruel or fair. For the servant's heart, beaten but not broken, clung fiercely to the smallest sparks of light. You have walked the halls, felt the cold stone beneath bare feet, carried the buckets that strained your shoulders, and breathed the smoke that seared your lungs. You have tasted hunger without food, exhaustion without rest, labor without end. You have bowed your head, swallowed your pride, and endured punishments for mistakes not your own. This was the life of a medieval servant. Invisible yet indispensable, vital yet forgotten. A life defined not by freedom or dignity, but by obedience, endurance, and silence. And here lies the truth. Most of us today could not survive even a single day in their place. We who complain at small discomforts, who grow restless without leisure, who expect recognition for our efforts, what would we do when faced with endless labor, constant hunger, and no rights to shield us? The servants of the medieval world did not live, they endured. Their strength was not chosen but forced. Their resilience was not celebrated but exploited. And their legacy, written in sweat and silence, was erased by history's quills. Yet as we dim the lights on this story, let us remember them. The unseen hands that lit fires, the weary feet that carried trays, the quiet voices that whispered prayers before sleep. Though forgotten by their masters, their lives built the very world in which those masters thrived. So why wouldn't you survive a day as a medieval servant? Because a day was not the true measure of suffering. It was the years, the decades, the lifetime spent without freedom or hope that broke the body and crushed the spirit. A single day would reveal enough hardship to overwhelm you, but for the servant, that day was only the beginning, repeated without end. And now, as you drift into your own sleep, safe in warmth, full from food, free in your choices, remember the countless souls who never had such peace. Remember the servants, whose lives remind us how precious even the simplest comforts truly are.